to Firestone Pacific Foods in Vancouver. 84 people are now confirmed sick, and that's up from 65 yesterday. Pat Torres joins us to answer some of those questions. And Pat, first, let's walk through the timeline. When did the first positive case turn up at the fruit company, and what do we know about the people who are infected?
Well, it's hard to know exactly when the infection got into the company, but it did turn up on Sunday, May 17th. And 2 days later, the company shut down when the health department said, hey, we need to get a hold of this thing. Because first there was one case, and then there was 3 cases, and then there was another 3. And so all of a sudden the health department said, this is an outbreak that's building and growing, and we need to know what's going on. So let's send everybody home if we can, have everybody isolate, and we need to let everybody know in their families as well that we might have a problem.
Now, with those 84 confirmed coronavirus cases, this is one of the largest outbreaks in the greater Portland area. Should we be surprised by this number, do you think?
Well, yes, and at the same time, no. I mean, yes, in that the peak of all the infections for the area has passed. It was, at least we hope that it has. It was a month or 6 weeks ago. But at the same time, no, because of the nature of the work. When you're inside a processing plant, a lot of times you're, elbow to elbow or shoulder to shoulder with somebody, and they work, very intensely. And so the fact that if one person gets infected, then a lot of people are going to get infected, that's the no part. We've seen that around the country, not only at fruit packing plants, but also at meat packing plants. So unfortunately, once it gets into a place like that, it can spread quite quickly.
So what is Firestone Pacific Foods doing now to protect returning workers?
Well, they've done a deep dive clean on the entire plant, and they're going to be doing things like checking everyone's temperature, I think, as they come into work each day. And it's unclear when the company and the plant is going to open again. They put out some guidance that seemed to show that it was going to be this Thursday, but when I asked the health department officer about that today, he seemed a little surprised and said, hey, he would need to look at exactly what that was. But they also have the ability to put in plexiglass shields, maybe around some of the workstations, make sure that there's lots of hand sanitizers, make sure that there's lots of personal protective gear. They have said that they are going to be doing that. And so they're also expanding some covered break areas outside so that people can easily socially distance, outside the plant, even when it's raining, and not have to be huddled together. So they're taking a number of steps to try and make it safe when people come back. They also pointed out in their release that under the president's guidelines, they are considered an essential business because they're providing food, fresh frozen berries, to the population. And so they are able to, come back as soon as they can get the blessing from the health department and start their production again. So we'll see.
Now, looking at the big picture here for everybody else, last week, Clark County applied to enter phase 2 of Washington's reopening plan, but the county's application is now on hold. Can you talk more about the ramifications of this outbreak?
Well, that's why the outbreak is such a huge deal. I mean, it would be big on its own because there's a lot of people and a lot of families impacted, and not just the workers, but I think 15 or more people at home that the workers came home to also now have this thing. But the huge impact is that for Clark County, they're still in phase 1 of the Washington state coronavirus rules, which keeps a lot of small businesses from reopening. And so they had hoped to be able to do that maybe by June 1st, and they'd actually put in the application to go into what they're calling phase 2. But then suddenly when this thing came up, the state folks are like, hey, let's just put that phase 2 on hold. We're not sure you're ready to move forward. The state health officer, Dr. Melnick, says he's going to argue that point and say that it's unfair to look at the entire county and infection rate, and that if you just move the fruit packing folks over to the side, the rest of the county has a low infection rate. But he also admitted that about 18 people out of that 84 tested positive with no symptoms, so they were asymptomatic. And that's a little troubling because maybe the county just has a low infection rate because not everybody's been tested. He also said that he thinks everybody in the county should be tested. So we'll see. But right now, that's why this is such a huge deal, not just for the workers and the company and their families, but for the entire county, the entire region there of Clark County. Galen?
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Pat, thank you so much for following this and answering our questions.
You bet. My pleasure.
Now, we've tracked the number of coronavirus cases in our area for months now, but what is it like to actually live with COVID-19? Jennifer English lives in Oregon City. She's one of more than 3,900 people in the state who have come down with the virus. Jennifer shared her experience with us.
The symptoms are so random and so crazy, and there's so many of them that you never know what you're going to experience next. So I actually went over to the fridge and I grabbed my lemon and I squeezed lemon in my mouth and didn't taste anything. And at that point, my heart just sank because I just knew that from that moment that I had been infected somehow. People say, oh, it's just the flu, because it's nothing like the flu. I've had the flu several times in my lifetime, and it's absolutely nothing like the flu.
Now, she goes on to explain the emotional experience of finding support in a Facebook group called Survivors Corps. You can visit the page if you'd like to learn more about what it's like to have COVID-19. The group's 50,000 members write about their experiences. A quick reminder here, you can send in your questions at any time. Just text the number right there on your screen, 503-226-5088. Coming up, can we expect a second peak in coronavirus cases? A big question there. But first, we're going to answer this one. Are COVID-19 symptoms different in kids than in adults? The answer, the CDC says the symptoms are similar in children and adults. But there is much more to learn about how the disease impacts kids.
Find podcasts.
We're back with a big question here. Will there be a second peak of coronavirus cases later this year? NBC News medical correspondent Dr. John Torres explains the new warning from the World Health Organization.
The threat of a second coronavirus wave. As we all fight the first wave of coronavirus, the World Health Organization says a second wave of the virus could come back later this year. But several places are still working to get the outbreaks in their country under control right now, including Central and South America, South Asia, and Africa. And infection rates are soaring in Brazil, the country now following the U.S. as having the second worst outbreak in the world. Today, the U.S. is expected to top over 100,000 deaths, a grim number we hoped we'd never reach. And the second wave of this disease could be a reality here in just a couple of months. Now, with the country partially reopened, we're already seeing cases increase in over 1/3 of the U.S. states. We can expect these spikes, but what we don't want is these spikes in cases to turn into outbreaks. So don't be surprised if the government says it's time to go back inside for a little while. We may need to stay home again to keep cases on a downward trend, especially when that second wave hits.
Now, if we do see a second peak, how would it impact reopening efforts, and what can people do to stay safe? I got some insight from Dr. Kavita Patel.
The reopening is going to be something that we'll have to look at community by community. So in Portland, for example, looking at the statistics of hospitalizations, positive cases, the amount of testing available. And here's what it means for an individual. Number one, if you're high risk or have a chronic condition or are older than the age of 60, you should probably try to stay at home as much as possible. When you are leaving, wear a non-medical mask, try to keep 6 feet distance, and keep practicing hand washing, hand hygiene. That's one of the ways that we can safely reopen, but also be cautious enough so that we avoid that second wave.
Now, during all of this, scientists continue to search for a COVID-19 vaccine to help us reach herd immunity. So what is that, and where did the phrase come from? Here's Brandon Ritteman with some answers.
The experts say we need herd immunity to beat coronavirus, but how do they know that, and why do they insist we need a vaccine to get it? The answer is a true story that involves a woman milking a cow, an Egyptian mummy, and General George Washington. He worried about one thing even more than the British, the disease they brought with them. Smallpox killed way more of Washington's men than the war itself. Smallpox was new to America, so less than 1 in 4 of Washington's men had any immunity. The disease spread like wildfire through the rest. That didn't happen to the Redcoats because they had herd immunity. Even if one soldier was vulnerable, he was surrounded by immune comrades, so less likely to be exposed. That's because more of the British had already survived the pox, and because of a new technique catching on in England. A doctor would take smallpox from a sick person and stick it in your arm. They called it inoculation. This gave you smallpox, but most people had milder cases. We'd never take the risk today. Not everyone survived this procedure, but George Washington had no safer options. In 1777, less than a year into the war, he did something no one had ever tried. He inoculated every soldier in his army, in secret. Historians think it may have decided the war. Soon after losing America, England did beat smallpox. Dr. Edward Jenner solved a mystery out in farm country. Milkmaids who caught cowpox from cows also gained protection from smallpox. This was great news. Cowpox is much less dangerous to people. The cowpox virus became our first vaccine. Signs of smallpox in ancient Egyptian mummies tell us it took at least 3,000 years to finally find a safe way to beat it. Now, in the coronavirus era, we're a lot better at vaccines. After half a year without one for COVID, only 2 or 3% of people on Earth have any natural immunity. A vaccine is the only way we know to get to the 60 or 70% we'll need to start benefiting from herd immunity without risking millions of lives. Cows probably won't give us that vaccine, but they'll still get the credit. Jenner named his discovery vaccination because vacca is Latin for, you guessed it. Thanks, Bessie.
What a story. I learned so much there. All right, well, when we come back, can your employer require you to take a COVID-19 test? Let's get to answer this question first, though. Can animals carry the virus that causes COVID-19 on their skin or fur? The answer, the CDC says there's currently no evidence that COVID-19 can spread to people from the skin or fur of animals.
2019 Ram 1500 trucks.
Welcome back to KGW Q&A. Now, many of you are working from home these days, but you can expect a lot of changes when you return to your office. So we want to know, can your employer require you to take a COVID-19 test? Evan Kozlov with our Verify team looks into it.
Here on the Verify team, we know there's a lot of confusion about the coronavirus, and that's why we're constantly tracking down the experts to get answers to your questions.
Yeah, these are tough questions.
Scott Oswald from the Employment Law Group is an expert on all things employment. Today we're answering this. Can your employer mandate that you get a COVID-19 test before you return to the office?
The answer is yes, as of just a few weeks ago.
Oswald is referring to a big announcement on April 23rd by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. On their website, they wrote that, quote, an employer may choose to administer COVID-19 testing to employees before they enter the workplace. And Oswald tells us that this announcement can have some major, real-life consequences.
So the guidance that the EEOC gives is going to be, in large measure, kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card for employers.
So that's the short answer. Yes, we can verify that your boss can mandate that you get a test before returning to the office. And yet Oswald says it's pretty unlikely your employer will do this unless you work for a larger company. That's because testing is logistically difficult and it could leave employers liable for any mistakes.
What is more likely is an employer that will do temperature testing, an employer that asks questions about exposure, and maybe even some employers that require their employees to obtain return to work certificates from their doctors.
With your Verify, this is Evan Kozlov.
We're also beginning to see the impact of COVID-19 on Portland restaurants. Why did one owner decide to close a handful of popular ones? Dave Machado ran Altamira City Tavern, Citizen Baker, Mil Centro, and Tanner Creek Tavern.
We kept making a lot of modifications, a lot of changes to our menu and to our hours of operation and everything we could think, but none of it really worked, and everything that we did was obsolete in a few days. When we were saying goodbye in the parking lot, everybody was saying see you in a month, see you on the other side. No one thought it was not going to be a temporary thing. No one.
This is really tough. Machado said the hardest part of all of this is having to tell his 170 employees they will not be coming back. The CDC says rats in some cities are becoming more aggressive during COVID-19. That's because they don't have as many food scraps to get from restaurants. But what about here? It's pretty unusual for people here to see something like this. These pictures show rats along an empty Bourbon Street in New Orleans. But in Multnomah County, an expert says reports of rodent problems have not gone up compared to other cities like Chicago or New York.
Our restaurants neighbor residential neighborhoods. So it shouldn't be too difficult if a restaurant closes, and if there was a rat problem there to begin with, for a rat to find an alternative food source. That residential neighborhoods are usually the most common source of food for rats here in Multnomah County.
The key is to make sure your food and home are secure. Cover any openings. Make sure your garbage is tightly covered and clear debris away from your home. Next, as hotels on the Oregon coast reopen, what measures are in place to keep people safe? But first, let's get to another question. Amid this pandemic, can my kid hang out with their friends? The answer, the key to slowing the spread of COVID-19 is practicing social distancing. If kids are playing outside their own homes, the CDC recommends that they stay 6 feet away from anyone who is not in their own household.
GW News app. A lot has changed because of this pandemic. Even some childhood rituals like summer camp. Now, even that is going virtual, but some parents are crying foul. Let's connect the dots. As traditional summer camps struggle with how to reopen safely, some are choosing to go virtual. And not all are doing it the same way. Some are offering interactive webinars for small groups. Others are videos, while some are large group Zoom calls. Some camps are even doing a mix of all three. While some parents love the idea, saying it's created a needed distraction for those stir-crazy kids, not everyone is loving it, mainly because of one big problem: screen time. With schools shut down and so many kids sheltering in place, time spent on devices has shot through the roof, and a lot of parents don't want to replace the joys of roaming outdoors during summer with more time in front of a computer. But there is another problem that some parents may not want to admit. Summer camp is often the time they get some breathing room from their kids. Most of these virtual camps request or require a parent or guardian to be on hand for support. And after spending the last couple of months homeschooling, there are parents out there not willing to repeat that experience over the summer. Connecting the dots, I'm Lorent, Rico.
Now that hotels and Airbnbs are back open in some Oregon coast towns, what precautions are hotels taking to keep visitors and employees safe? This morning on Sunrise Extra, we spoke to the manager of Surf Sand Resort and Stephanie Inn in Cannon Beach.
I would tell you that throughout lodging in general, but especially I can speak specifically to our properties and Cannon Beach as a whole, I think you're going to see, masks will be worn by all team members until we, are guided in a different direction that is going to be part of the new norm, right? You will see, housekeepers may have a smock or a jacket on as they go into clean a room. You will have hand sanitation, hand gel throughout the properties, accessible for anybody at any time.
We want to stress, though, you're still advised not to travel between counties under the state's stay-at-home order. We want to thank you so much for joining us tonight for KGW Q&A. If you still have questions, our past stories may answer them for you. You can go straight to kgw.com/answers to see all of our past Q&As. I'm Galen Etlin. Have a great night.